Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. I'm your teacher Simin Amer, and I'm here again with a new lecture. And today we are going to start a new chapter. I hope everything is going well at your side. So please stay at home and stay blessed. Let's proceed to the lecture. This is my lecture number 10 for grade Prio, and today we will have a history class. So we are going to start chapter number 3, which is what were the causes and consequences of the War of Independence 1857 to 1858. So page number 27, and the topic is the War of Independence, and here is the introduction. In 1857, the British faced a serious challenge to their control of India. In that year, there were a series of uprisings which were known by British historians as the Indian Mutiny and by Indian historians as the War of Independence. These differing names for the same event show how history can be a matter of interpretation. So, if we take the example of Kashmir, and the fight of Kashmir, the freedom of Kashmir, or the struggle of the Kashmiris. If we take the struggle of the Kashmiris for towards the Indian government, this is a mutiny. But towards the Kashmiri people, this is the war of independence. This is the war for freedom. Same here. The uprising was towards the British government. It was like the Indian mutiny. Mutiny means the rebelling against the government. When someone is rebelling against the government, that is called mutiny. So, towards the British government or British historians, it was the Indian mutiny. It was their rebellionism. But towards the Indian historians or the Indian people, it was the War of Independence because they considered the British as an foreign invaders. So it was the War of Independence or the war for freedom for them. For the British, the events of 1857 were a revolt against their authority, which had to be crushed in order to maintain control. Revolt is a violent action against the authority. So they thought that this is the whole situation, the whole event was the revolt. That was a violent action against the government, against the British government. And this is the duty of the British government to crush, to maintain the order. To the Indians, the concept was different. To the Indians, it was a war to throw off the shackles of the foreign domination. To throw off the shackle means to throw off uh, the shackle is like a kind of chain of ankles like hatkadi. So it was for Indians, it was like a hatkadi in their hands, and they wanted to throw off this hatkadi. The reasons for the outbreak of the war in 1857 can be divided into four areas through different sections of a population were motivated by different factors. What they all had in common, however, was a resentment of British rule. Resentment means treating unfairly. The unfair treatment of the British government, that was a common cause. So, to fully understand this topic, you will need to make sure you understand how the British imposed their rule on the subcontinent, and we are already done with this topic in the previous lectures. The Sepoy Mutiny, as it was called by British, was in fact the war of independence against the British government in 1857. This is what I told you in the previous slide, that towards the British government, it was the Sepoy Mutiny or the Indian Mutiny. Sepoy Mutiny means mutiny is the rebelling against the government, or Sepoy was the Sipahi in India in their troops, in the British troop who were Indians. So the Sipahi mutiny, like there was a Sipahi or Sepoy who refused to use the greased cartridges that was introduced by the British, and on that issue was the cartridges was made up of pig and fat cow, which was unacceptable for the Muslims and for the Hindus. The East India Company came under a direct threat caused by a civil rebellion in central India. Since the soldiers were militarily trained and higher in number, they took control of Delhi and pushed the English army out. Bahadur Shah Zafar was made the King of India. So, as I said that in the previous lectures, that the British expanded their control of the India and they took the whole of India under their control. And the Indians were so annoyed, like they were forced to, they rose up their voice against the British government, and that was in a form of war. The causes of the war were divided in uh, four different ways. Like there were different ways that why Indians stood against the government, the British government. But there were in different areas there were different reasons that people were so annoyed that they rose up against the British government. So these were like some of the causes were political, some were religious causes, some were social causes, the economic causes, and the military causes. So the first cause was the political cause. In your book on page number 27, there's a political cause. In your book, it is given like in a two or three paras. But for your ease and better understanding, I have taken some important points for your better understanding. I am giving you with all its explanation in the next slides. So the points are the British policy of expansion that was obviously, especially the doctrine of lapse and the annexation of oath, in which they just took an excuse that the people were not fairly treated by the ruler, and the disrespect shown to the Bahadur Shah Zafar was a ruler of that area, and treatment given to Nana Sahib and the Rani of Rani, who was Lakshmi Bhai, and the absentee sovereignty of the British. The Indian wealth was drained to England. So let me explain all these points. So the first one is the political causes. Let me explain the points I have given in the previous slide. These are some of the points that I have taken from the previous chapter. Like in this chapter, in this political cause on page number 27, there are only three short paras and some of the points are not mentioned here, but I want to give you some extra explanation for your better understanding. So to expand their territories in India, British fought many wars like War of Buxar, the Mysore War, the Maratha War, and even the Sikh War. So these were like something that happened in the past that was really annoying for the Indians from that time. So this was already, we can say, the political causes that was started from very earlier time. Then Lord Wellesley, who was introduced a system in which Indian states were brought under the British control without annexing them. So under this system, Indian rulers agreed to accept British as supreme power and foreign relations with and would not enter any alliance or wars. British resident at their headquarters and would not employ any European without consulting and maintain British troops at their own cost and virtually lost independence. That was the first point of the political cause. Again, here is the doctrine of lapse. That was a policy that we are already done in the previous chapter with it. So, as the British extended their control, the local leaders saw their authority decline. So, like Dalhousie's use of the doctrine of lapse was particularly unpopular. Um, I have told you that it was just an this was a policy given by the Lord Dalhousie just to annex the Indian territories. So especially like the annexation of O, that was really embarrassing for them. Like the seizure of the oath in 1856 convinced many Indian leaders that the British were simply greedy and land grabbers. So they captured Oath, although the Nawab of Oath had many heirs like a son, and they just gave an excuse that he didn't treat his public or his people um, fairly. So they took his area under their control. That was Oath. So the mistreatment of the Mughal emperor was another cause of unrest. It was another cause of disturbance for Indians. By 1857, the emperor had little power left, but was an important symbolic figure. Bahadur Shah, Mughal ruler, was under protection of the company, but after his death, Lord Dalhousie announced that ruler's widow Zeenat Mahal and successors can't use Red Fort as palace. And in 1956, Lord Canning announced that the successors can't use imperial titles. This hurt sentiments of Muslims. The treatment given to Nana Sahib and Rani of Jhansi, Lakshmi Bai, was another political cause. Nana Sahib was sent to Kanpur away from Pune. He then travelled to different parts of country to create awareness about British policies, and Rani of Jhansi, who was Lakshmi Bai, who was the victim of doctrine of lapse, became bitter enemy of the British. Other rules also had a doubt in the British. And Indians were drained to England how embarrassing it was, like India was being ruled by British from England. Unlike other rulers like Mughals who spent the revenue collected from India in India. Revenue is the annual, we can say the annual or the monthly profit that is collected from India, so it should be spent on India. Mughals were spending this on India, but England was British was the British government was governing India from England. So they were not spending India's wealth on India, but they were draining all the Indians' wealth to the England. But in case of the British, Indians felt that wealth of India was drained to England and wasn't used for the welfare of Indians. So these were the political causes that led the Indians for a mutiny towards the British rulers. So these are the social religious causes, social and religious causes. Uh, these are some of the points, like 7 points I've taken extra for you. But let me explain from your book first. Let me give you the social causes first. As British political control grew, so did the spread of British culture. We have already seen how the British considered it their duty to spread their superior culture. In 1835, one English administrator talked of how a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. So that's how they were giving their culture the superiority. Like he said, a single shelf of a book in a library, a single shelf of a European library, a single shelf of books was worth more than a native literature, the local literature of Indian and Arabia. So that was the level of their superiority. Many of the British were more thoughtful than this, but in general, the British treated the Indians as an inferior race. Towards them, they were superior, and Indians were inferior. Indians and British did not generally mix as social equals, and the British societies regarded themselves as small oases of culture in a largely uncivilized world. What does it mean? Small oases of culture in a largely uncivilized world. You know what is oasis? Oasis is an isolated area of vegetation in a desert. This is isolated area of a pond of water in a whole desert. So this is how they said, like towards themselves, they were like a small oasis, the very green and vegetative area with the water of pond. But the Indians were the largely uncivilized world. It was the Indians were like a desert, a dry desert. This arrogant attitude, coupled with the introduction of a new way of life with its railways, roads, and telegraph, was unacceptable to many Indians. These were the social causes. And the religious causes were like many Indians feared that Islam, Hinduism, and Sikhism were under threat from British rule. The British always denied this, but they were not believed. It was probably not the case, but it was true that Christian missionaries came to India. Missionaries like the one who came with the mission, with the plan, the Christian missionaries who came here to convert Muslims and Hindus in Christianity. So these Christian missionaries came to India to convert the local population as well as set up schools. In these schools, the missionaries taught Christianity and accept locals who worked for them to give up their religion and follow the Christians' teachings. Then were some economic causes that led to the Indians' mutiny. We have already seen how the British merchants mm, s- made substantial profits, full profits from their trading in goods and such as textiles. The British also followed a practice of imposing high taxation to ensure that they exploited India's wealth to the full. Exploited like they got full benefit of Indians' wealth. So they imposed high taxation on Indians' good, and they took off all the duties or taxes from British goods, so that it affected the local merchants. Peasants and small landowners. Peasants also are the small landowners. In particular, found it difficult to pay the increasing taxes, and resentment grew. Resentment, I have told you that this is unfair treatment. It was also true that some tax collectors were corrupt. So there was also a corruption in their groups and kept some of the tax money for themselves. Obviously, if you are collecting taxes, that is to be spent on the countries, but they kept the money for themselves. At the same time as they were imposing high taxes on India, the British were also keeping the salary of the sepoys. Sepoys are the sipahi or the troops, the soldiers. So they were keeping the salaries of these soldiers very low. That was causing more resentment. India was forced to export cotton silk at cheaper rate to England, and they were forced to for the plantation of indigo and tea. Indians had to accept ready-made British clothes or British goods. Indians' products had high import duties in England. Indian handmade products could not compete with the machine-made British products, and problem of unemployment was increased. India had no agricultural surplus, which raised the prices of raw material in India. Agricultural surplus means agriculture like we are taking raw material from agriculture. So agriculture surplus, the extra amount than the consumption of the Indian people, which is like people are trading or selling then these things or even exporting. So there was no surplus, which because of this situation, the prices was raised for Indians. After Battle of Plassey, British stopped bringing gold to India. Raw material was bought in England from the surplus revenues of Bengal and started looting India's raw materials, resources, and wealth. That was the drain of wealth, like the transfer of wealth from India to England. The decay of cottage industries and handicrafts. Cottage industry is a small industry that usually People are making things at their homes. So this is small industry and the handicrafts, the crafts that are made, that are handmade. So heavy duties killed Indian cottage industries and handicrafts. Heavy duties were put on Indians' products, and there was no taxation or duties that was taken away from the British products. Imported British goods worsened this condition. Export of cotton and silk was seized, art of spinning and weaving was killed, creating severe unemployment, absence of royal buyers, princes, zamindars, etc. So unemployment grew, and there was the large number of people were unemployed. Inhuman treatment of indigo cultivators, like they were forced to grow only indigo and to cultivate only indigo plants. They were forced, other crops were destroyed if didn't follow the orders, and cattle and their livestock were taken away as punishment. Then was the poverty and famines. For poverty is the poorness, and famine is the shortage of food. And British didn't bother at all for any poorness, for any shortage of food. Peasants had to pay heavy taxes and land revenues, and they were unable to pay. And there was a decline of landed aristocracy. It's a class of persons holding exceptional rank and privileges, especially the hereditary nobility. Some of the people were unable to produce evidence of their ownership, and their lands were auctioned. Auction is like they were nilam karna, that they were auctioned. Then there were some military causes as well. As you will read on page 29, the revolt started over the issue of greased cartridges. You know what were the greased cartridges? These were the cartridges introduced by the British government. They introduced the new rifles, and there were some greased cartridges used in these rifles. The cartridges were issued with rifles but were greased with lard. Lard is the pork fat or the pig fat, which was regarded unclean for the Muslims. And it was also greased with the tallow. Tallow is the cow fat, which angered the Hindus as cow were equally to a goddess to them. So that was unacceptable for the Muslims and for the Hindus as well. However, there were more deep-seated reasons for discontent amongst members of the armed forces. Most of the soldiers in the East Indian Company's armies were Indians, and the sepoys and the sowars, the cavalry, were almost exclusively Indians. So the soldiers were all Indians, but the officer class was almost exclusively British. So that was a resentment here, that only the soldiers were all Indians and the officer class was all British. This caused great resentment. There was also regular rumors like afwah, that Muslims, Hindus, and Sikh soldiers would be forced to convert to Christianity and that they might be sent to fight abroad. And that was unacceptable to the Hindus. The use of Indian troops in Afghanistan had also proved unpopular as Hindu soldiers did not want to leave their mother India. It was no wonder that one Indian observer in 1857 said, "All native army is dissatisfied with the government." So there was the ill treatment of Indian soldiers. They were uh, mm, they were ill treated, they were poorly fed and badly housed. Their salaries were kept very low and they were deprived of allowances. And there was less chance of any promotion, although all the Indians were on the post of soldiers only, and that was miserable. And the higher class or the official class was exclusively British only. So these were all the causes that led to an Indian mutiny or the war against the British. So these were only the causes that forced the Indians to raise against their British government. Now let me tell you about the events, how the war started and what happened next, and then how it came to an end. In January 1857, the British announced that they were introducing a new rifle with the paper cartridge covered in grease to keep the powder dry. And I've told you that the grease which was used for the cartridge was made up of lard, which is a pork fat or the pig fat, and that was unacceptable for the Muslims. And even the grease was also made from the tallow, which is a cow fat, and that was unacceptable for the Hindus, and they consider cows as equally as a goddess for them. Before the cartridge could be loaded, the end had to be bitten off. So the end of the cartridge was to be bitten off with the teeth. And that was unacceptable for the Muslims, especially because that was greased with the pig fat. However, it was rumored that the grease on the cartridge was made from the fat of both cows and pigs. The sepoys or the soldiers were so angered by this that they refused to use the new cartridge. The next step was the execution of the Mangal Pandey, because he was the man who first refused to use this cartridge. In March, a soldier named Mangal Pandey, defeated his British officer and was executed. But the real trouble began 2 months later. In May, sepoys or soldiers in Meerut refused to touch the new cartridges. They were court-martialed and put in prison. But their fellow soldiers broke into the prison and freed them. So that was a real trouble for British. And the fellow soldiers came and they uh, broke into the prison and they freed their fellow soldiers. Meerut was sacked and British officers and other Europeans were put to death. That was the action taken by Indians. They sacked the Meerut. The whole Meerut was sacked, they captured, and some of the British officers and Europeans were put to death. Then the soldiers marched to Delhi and captured it. So the Indian soldiers even captured Delhi. The Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah too became the unifying symbol for the uprising and winning the support of both Muslims and Hindus. The war spread quickly and the British lost control of many of the areas like Mathura, Kanpur, Jhansi, Allahabad, and Delhi as well. So all these areas came into the Indian soldiers' hand. Lucknow was also taken, and the British rule came to an end, and that was ceased to exist throughout what is now called Uttar Pradesh. Till Uttar Pradesh, all the areas were came into the Indians' hand. In Kanpur, Indian troops led by Nana Sahib rose up against the British and kept their forces trapped for over 3 weeks. After being promised safe passage out of the city, the British surrendered. The British surrendered and they were promised that the free passage would be given to them and they will leave. However, as they left the city, Nana Sahib's force turned on them and the British force plus 300 women and children were massacred. Massacred means they were brutally killed. When the British recaptured the city, when they recaptured the city, they carried out even worse atrocities in revenge. So, as a revenge, they they carried out worse atrocities. Atrocity means extremely cruel act that was taken by the British. However, the British proved to be powerful to be defeated by an uncoordinated uprising across many areas. In September 1857, Delhi was regained by the British. So the British came again into power and they regained Delhi. And Bahadur Shah, the Mughal emperor, surrendered peacefully, but his sons Mirza Mughal, Mirza Sultan, and Mirza Abu Bakr were brutally murdered, and their heads were carted and then presented to the emperor as a lesson because he rose against the British government. So they cut the heads of his three sons, and these were presented to the emperor as a lesson. Lucknow was also regained by the British in September 1857. After the wall of Lucknow, the main center of opposition was Jhansi. So even many of the areas, almost we can say all the areas, were regained by the British. But the main center of opposition at the time was Jhansi. Here the sepoys were led by Lakshmi Bai, the Rani of Jhansi. The ruler of Jhansi, she was Rani and her name was Lakshmi Bai. She was assisted by a Titiya Topi, an Indian general of great ability. Titiya Topi was her assistant. He was the Indian general of great ability. But in June 1858, the British killed Lakshmi Bai in battle, although Titiya Topi escaped, but he was later captured and executed as well. Following the defeat of Lakshmi Bai, the British eliminated pockets of opposition. So all the opposition pockets of oppositions were eliminated because the Jhansi was the last pocket of opposition which was also eliminated, and the war was officially declared at an end in August 1858. So the war started with the act of Mangal Pandey, who was a sepoy and he refused to touch the greased cartridges. And the war came to an end with the murder of the Lakshmi Bai, and she was the Rani of Jhansi, and that was the last pocket of opposition for the British. So I think that's enough for today's lecture. Here I'm going to give you an assignment, only one question for today, but this is a lengthy question and you have to create your answer for 2 pages at least because the question is for 14 marks. And the question is, do you agree that the use of greased cartridges were the main cause for the War of Independence of 1857? Give reasons to your answer. Now you have to give your conclusion, your answer, your choice. Like I have given 4 to 5 causes in this lecture, like political causes, social causes, religious causes, economic causes, and military causes. Grease cartridges came under military causes. Now, whatever choice, whatever option I give you in a question like greased cartridges, first you have to explain this problem. What was the problem of the greased cartridges? Then you have to explain all the problems, like there were some political problems, this and this, and then economic problems, then military problems, social problems, religious problems, and in the end, in a small para or in just 2 3 lines, you have to give your own conclusion that you were agree this point, or that you are agree with this point, the Greece cartridges, or no, you think like the political problems, the doctrine of lapse is very was more important than greased cartridges, or you think that uh, keeping the salary of the sepoys low, that was a major problem, or you think that their superior culture, they consider themselves as superior, considering the Indians as inferior. So that was a huge problem, or many other problems that we just discussed in this lecture. So please create your answer, do your do this assignment on your neat notebook, make a margin line, must try today's day and date, and please maintain your index. Thank you so much, dear students, for watching this video. I'll come again with another video with a new lecture. Till then, bye.